Throughout history, women have faced unspeakable oppression and enduring cruelty that shaped societal norms and practices. Beyond being denied basic rights, they were subjected to extreme forms of punishment designed to control and suppress them. These methods of torture were not just tools of punishment, but also symbols of subjugation. In this video, we explore the most brutal tortures done on women throughout history. Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is perhaps one of the most infamous and terrifying torture devices in history. With its striking appearance, a tall, coffin-like structure lined with sharp metal spikes, the Iron Maiden has become a symbol of medieval cruelty. The concept behind the device was simple but horrifying. When a victim was locked inside, the spikes would impale their body, causing excruciating pain and suffering. The design was allegedly meant to avoid major organs, ensuring that death came slowly, prolonging the victim's torment. Despite its notoriety, the true historical existence of the Iron Maiden remains controversial. Many historians argue that the device was more a product of myth or later invention than an actual medieval torture tool. There are no verified records of the Iron Maiden being used during the medieval period, and most surviving examples of the device date from the 18th or 19th centuries, suggesting that they were created for display or sensationalism rather than for practical use in torture. The idea of the Iron Maiden fits neatly into popular images of medieval brutality. Dungeons filled with dark, sinister devices designed to inflict maximum pain. It serves as a chilling symbol of a time when torture was used as a tool of both punishment and intimidation. However, the fact that the device may have been more of a historical fiction than a real instrument of torture doesn't lessen its impact on the imagination. In modern times, the Iron Maiden continues to capture the public's fascination. Its image is often associated with shadowy medieval castles, where it is believed to have been used by cruel rulers or inquisitors. While the truth behind its use may be debated, the Iron Maiden still stands as a symbol of the extremes of human cruelty and the darker aspects of medieval justice. The rack. The rack stands out as one of the most notorious torture devices of the medieval period. Designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive, this gruesome apparatus was employed across Europe during the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. Its primary purpose was to extract confessions, uncover information, or punish those accused of crimes such as heresy, treason, or conspiracy. The structure of the rack was deceptively simple. It consisted of a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were tightly bound to these rollers with ropes. As the interrogation or punishment began, a mechanism, usually a crank or a lever, was turned, causing the rollers to rotate. This action stretched the victim's body, pulling their limbs in opposite directions. The tension on the ropes grew gradually, and with it, the agony of the individual. The pain inflicted by the rack was excruciating and prolonged. As the victim's body was stretched beyond its natural limits, joints dislocated, muscles tore, and tendons snapped. The popping and cracking sounds of the body breaking apart added a psychological horror to the physical torment. Victims were often left permanently maimed, their bodies twisted and crippled beyond repair. Beyond the physical damage, the psychological impact of the rack was immense. Many victims confessed to crimes they had not committed, simply to bring an end to their suffering. For inquisitors and authorities, this made the rack an effective tool for securing confessions, whether truthful or fabricated. The use of the rack was not limited to any single region or group. It became a symbol of state and religious power during times of political upheaval and religious persecution. It was often employed during the Spanish Inquisition and similar campaigns aimed at rooting out dissent or opposition. By the 18th century, attitudes toward torture began to shift, and the use of devices like the rack gradually declined. However, its legacy endures as one of the darkest symbols of medieval justice. Replicas of the rack are often displayed in museums and historical exhibitions, serving as a stark reminder of the lengths to which authorities once went to enforce obedience and extract confessions, or the appearance of justice. Silencing women through humiliation. The scold's bridle, also known as the brank, was a cruel instrument of punishment used primarily in England and Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries. This device targeted women accused of being scolds, a term used to describe those who nagged, gossiped, or spoke out of turn. In a society that valued female submission and silence, The scold's bridle served as a brutal reminder of the consequences of defying these norms. The device consisted of an iron cage or muzzle that fit over the head with a tongue plate designed to suppress speech. This plate was often spiked or serrated, pressing against the tongue to inflict pain and prevent the wearer from speaking. Some versions of the bridle included additional humiliating features, such as animal-like shapes or bells, which drew further public attention to the victim. The punishment was as much about public shaming as it was about physical control. Women forced to wear the scold's bridle were often paraded through the streets, subjected to the ridicule and scorn of their communities. The jingling bells or grotesque designs of the device added to the spectacle, making the wearer an object of mockery. For many, the psychological damage from this public humiliation was as devastating as the physical discomfort. Accusations leading to the use of the scold's bridle were often rooted in societal misogyny. Women who challenged authority, voiced opinions, or otherwise failed to conform to societal expectations were at risk of being labeled as scolds. In some cases, the punishment extended beyond mere speech and was applied to women accused of witchcraft or moral transgressions. While the scold's bridle was never as widespread as other forms of punishment, its use underscores the gendered nature of justice in early modern Europe. The device symbolized the attempt to control not only women's bodies but also their voices, enforcing silence and submission through fear and humiliation. By the 18th century, shifting views on justice and the role of women in society led to the decline of the scold's bridle. Today, it stands as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which patriarchal societies have gone to suppress female autonomy and expression. Replicas are often displayed in museums, serving as a stark symbol of gendered oppression and the darker aspects of historical punishment practices. These are all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want more of such content. Soon, we will be back with another spine-chilling episode. Till then, enjoy our other videos.